Haiti's government has taken a key step towards holding long-delayed elections with the creation of a body which will oversee the polls. The 9-member Provisional Electoral Council, set up on Wednesday, has been tasked with organizing elections by February 2026. The last time Haitians voted someone into power was in 2016. Since then, armed gangs have seized control of almost the entire capital, Port-au-Prince, as well as large swaths of rural areas of Haiti. So far, 7 members of the Provisional Electoral Council, which is CEP, has been named. Among them are representatives of the media, academia, trade unions, and religious groups. The creation of the CEP comes less than 2 weeks after a visit of Port-au-Prince by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who had urged Haiti's provisional government to move forward with the electoral process. Blinken said setting up electoral council was a, and I quote, critical next step.
We've seen the presidential council be stood up, government and prime minister stood up, the arrival of Kenyan colleagues to support the police in this critical security mission. We're starting to see results from that, all with the objective of putting Haiti on a path to elections next year.
I'm going to vote because the country needs to change, but I personally don't have a candidate yet.
Presidential elections were last held in Haiti in 2016, when Jovenel Moïse of the Tenkel party was elected for a 5-year term. Since Moïse's murder by Colombian mercenaries in July 2021, the post of president has been vacant. In the following years, Haiti was governed by Ariel Henry, the man whom President Moïse had nominated as prime minister shortly before he was killed. But when Henry left for a summit in Guyana on 25 February 2024, gangs seized the international airport in Port-au-Prince and prevented him from returning. Henry resigned in April, and a Transitional Presidential Council, TPC, was created to lead the country until elections can be held. The TPC named Gary Conille as an interim prime minister to serve until a democratically elected government takes over. A Kenyan-led multinational security force was also dispatched to help the Haitian police rein in the gangs. While the multinational force has succeeded in rounding up some gang leaders, the power of these criminal organizations has grown to such an extent that Prime Minister Conille expanded the state of emergency to the whole country earlier this month. The multinational force suffers from overfunding, and so far, only 600 Kenyans and a small contingent of Jamaicans have arrived in Haiti. Last week, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres berated the international community for not offering Haiti more help. And I quote, "I find it a scandal that it has been so difficult to mobilize funds for such a dramatic situation."
Ladies and gentlemen of the media, good afternoon. I'd like to say a few words about what remains largely a forgotten crisis, despite its severity, the situation in Haiti. I'm just back from a visit to Port-au-Prince, and from there I attended the summit of the leaders of the Caribbean community in Trinidad and took part in a special session on Haiti. Later today, the Security Council will take up my report on the situation in the country. Let me be very clear. The Haitian people are trapped in a living nightmare. Humanitarian conditions are beyond appalling. Brutal gangs have a strange hold on the people of Haiti. Port-au-Prince is encircled by armed groups that are blocking roads, controlling access to food and health care, and undermining humanitarian support. Predatory gangs are using kidnappings and sexual violence as weapons to terrorize entire communities. And I've heard appalling accounts of women and girls being gang raped and of people being burned alive. The world must act now to stem the violence and instability. During my visit, I had the chance to meet the Prime Minister and many sectors of the Haitian society. Those meetings showed that there are signs of hope and possibility, but it requires action on several fronts and the recognition of a core truth. There can be no sustainable security without a political solution that allows for the restoration of democratic institutions. And there can be no lasting and inclusive political solutions without a drastic improvement of the security situation. Today, I want to make an appeal for concurrent action in three essential areas. First, the people of Haiti need action to address urgent humanitarian needs. The international community must now act to ease the suffering of the Haitian people. The United Nations Humanitarian Response Plan requires $720 million to help more than 3 million people. Yet, that plan is only 23% funded. I appeal to the world to extend a lifeline of support and fill that financial gap without delay. Second, the people of Haiti need action to tackle urgent security needs. I appeal to the members of the Security Council and to all relevant potential contributing countries to act now to create the conditions for the deployment of a multinational force to assist the Haitian National Police. The Haitian government requested these all the way back in October, and those appeals were echoed by many Haitians I met during my visit. I repeat, we are not calling for a military or political mission of the United Nations. We are calling for a robust security force deployed by member states to work hand in hand with the Haitian National Police to defeat and dismantle the gangs and restore security across the country. The police also need financing, training, and equipment. And all of this is critical to restoring the authority of the state and the delivery of vital services. My third appeal is for all social and political actors to accelerate their efforts towards a desperately needed political solution. And I also fully support CARICOM's mediation efforts in this regard. In Haiti, I welcome steps to find Haitian solutions to restore the constitutional order and urge the Prime Minister, the High Transitional Council, members of civil society and political parties to forge a political entente to end the crisis. Taking together these three vital and simultaneous steps are fundamental to breaking Haiti's cycle of suffering by addressing dramatic humanitarian and security challenges and forging a political pathway out of the crisis. I've seen the situation for myself. Conditions are desperate, but solutions are possible if we act now. We cannot forget the Haitian people, and the world must step up. While I was in Haiti and Trinidad, I was deeply disturbed by the news from Jenin in the occupied West Bank. I strongly condemned all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror. Israel's airstrikes and ground operations in a crowded refugee camp were the worst violence in the West Bank in many years, with a significant impact on civilians, including more than 100 injured and thousands forced to flee. Schools and hospitals were damaged, water and electricity networks were disrupted, and people in need were prevented from accessing essential care and relief. All those injured must have access to medical care, and humanitarian workers must be able to reach everyone in need. I once again call on Israel to abide by its obligations under international law, including the duty to exercise restraint and use only proportional force, and the duty to minimize damage and injury and respect and preserve human life. The use of airstrikes is inconsistent with the conduct of law enforcement operations. I also remind Israel, as the occupying power, that it has a responsibility to ensure that the civilian population is protected against all acts of violence. I understand Israel's legitimate concerns with its security, but escalation is not the answer. It simply bolsters radicalization and leads to a deepening cycle of violence and bloodshed. Restoring the hope of the Palestinian people in a meaningful political process leading to a two-state solution and the end of the occupation is an essential contribution by Israel to its own security. Thank you. I will answer 3 questions. There is another stakeout to take place.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. The United Nations human rights expert on Haiti, Mr. William O'Neill, said yesterday that Haiti's understaffed police force desperately needs between 1,000 and 2,000 international police experts trained to combat armed gangs and organized crime. Do you agree on his assessment of what's needed in Haiti? And if I could possibly add a quick question on the record global temperatures in the world reached in the past few days and your comment on that implication.
Well, naturally, the right number of people, of elements of security forces that will be needed needs to be assessed, taking into account the security situation, but it must be a robust force with a meaningful number of officers. So I believe that those numbers do not reflect any exaggeration. The situation we are witnessing now is the demonstration that climate change is out of control. And one reason more for increased ambition and increased justice. What we are witnessing now is emissions still growing. This is the moment in which we all need to assume our responsibilities. And I recall that I made an appeal for an increased ambition both for developed and emerging economies, hoping that developed countries can get to net zero emissions as close as possible to 2040 and the emerging economies as close as possible to 2050, but that we start by now reducing the emissions in order to get a meaningful decrease of about 45% at the end of the decade. If we do not go this way, if we persist in delaying key measures that are needed, I think we are moving into a catastrophic situation, as the last 2 records in temperature demonstrate.
Secretary General, can you clarify if your condemnation specifically applies to Israel in your statement?
Sorry?
Can you clarify if your condemnation in your statement specifically applies to Israel?
No, it applies to all use of excessive force, and obviously in this situation there was an excessive force used by Israeli forces.
Secretary General, 3 special rapporteurs today have accused Israel of possible war crimes in Jenin for actions that amount to egregious violations of international law and standards of use of force. Does that square with what you have described today in terms of the attacks on hospitals, on infrastructure, civilian infrastructure? Do those attacks amount to war crimes? And yesterday, Palestine's ambassador again talked about the need for an international protection force. Is this something you can endorse? Do Palestinians need an international force to protect them from Israel?
I don't think it's realistic to think that we can have a military force sent to Israel. I don't think the Israeli government would consent on that possibility. But I think we need to find mechanisms to allow for the protection of civilians in these dramatic circumstances. Thank you very much.